The afternoon sunlight slanted like a blade across Blackwater Market, cutting chewed shadows into the faces of men who smelled of whiskey and sweat. Silas Crowe stood just beyond the tent flaps, his back against the rough stone of an watching the way the crowd pressed and shoved. He'd been watching markets for 15 years, 18 if he counted the years when he still wore a star. His eyes were a map of spent storms. His hat rode low enough that only the tip of a crooked scar on his cheek showed. A wanted poster flapped on a nearby post, his face there in charcoal and contempt. He let the paper sway. He had been exiled from every badge he'd ever earned, but he still had the habits of a hunter. The market stretched before him like a wound in the earth. Blackwater had always been a place where desperate men came to trade in desperate things. Cotton bales sat next to crates of stolen silver. Horses with brands burned over other brands stood tied to posts. And there, in the center of it all, human beings sat on wooden platforms like furniture waiting to be appraised. The smell of commerce mixed with the stench of fear, creating an atmosphere that made even hardened men walk with their hands close to their guns. Silas had first come to Blackwater 3 months ago, following the trail of a man named Dutch Morrison, a cattle rustler with a price on his head worth more than most men made in a year. But Morrison had vanished like smoke, and Silas had found himself staying longer than intended. There was something about this place that held him, something that reminded him of all the choices that had led him to wear wanted posters instead of badges. The auctioneer's voice pealed out like a bell. Lot 9, a fine piece of property, sight to the world not yet known. The men laughed, and something in Silas tightened. On a raised platform a woman sat, hands folded in her lap, a battered blanket over knees that trembled. Her hair was the color of winter wheat, braided and knotted with a ribbon gone to dust. She wore a small carved charm on a string against her throat, an object he'd seen once before in another life, and when she sang, her voice cut loose the filth of the crowd, and the day fell oddly hush. The song was soft, almost whispered, but it carried across the market like a prayer. Other voices fell silent as she sang, even the roughest men pausing their haggling to listen. There was something pure in that voice, something that didn't belong in a place like this. It was the kind of voice that belonged in churches or beside cradles, not on auction blocks. He recognized the tune, a lullaby his mother had sung when the world had been kinder. That song did something inside him that law and exile had worn thin, but not entirely gone. He pushed back from the stone and stepped forward. The closer he got, the more the men jeered, and one of them, a buyer with gold teeth and a fat ring, clapped his hands and called, "She's blind, makes for a steady worker. Who'll start the bidding?" Silas felt the world compress into clean, merciless lines. He knew how the market worked. The men who bought people at these auctions were the same men who paid deputies and burned out homesteads. They were the ones who decided which laws mattered and which ones could be bought or buried. He knew, too, the kind of bargains they struck with favors and threats. He knew locks and keys and the anatomy of a neck under a rope. He also knew how to move without being seen, how to pick a latch with a sliver of bone and patience. The memories came flooding back, memories of a time when he'd worn a badge and believed in justice. Sheriff Silas Crowe of Millfield County, they'd called him. He'd been young then, maybe too young to understand that justice and law weren't always the same thing. The badge had been heavy on his chest, but it had felt right. He'd cleaned up 3 towns, brought order to chaos, made the frontier a little safer for decent folk. But then came the Hendricks case. A wealthy rancher's son had been accused of assault, and the evidence had been clear as daylight. Witnesses, physical proof, everything needed to put the boy away. But the rancher had money, and money had a way of making evidence disappear and witnesses forget what they'd seen. When Silas had refused to let the case die, when he'd pushed for trial against the wishes of men who owned half the territory, they'd found ways to make him the criminal. planted evidence, false testimony, a frame-up so thorough that even Silas had almost believed it himself. One day he was Sheriff Crowe, respected lawman. The next he was Silas Crowe, fugitive, with a price on his head and nowhere to run but into the Badlands where wanted men went to disappear. For a moment he considered walking away. The last time he'd put himself between a man and a wrong. The consequences had been his entire life turned inside out. He'd lost everything, his job, his reputation, his future. The woman on the platform was just another victim in a world full of them. What difference could one man make? The woman's fingers moved lightly over the hem of the blanket, counting the threads, listening to voices, mapping the afternoon in the way blind people map things, by air and echo and smell. Silas watched the way she tipped her face as someone spoke to her, as if she could find faces by voice alone. Her voice, when she sang again, reached him like a rope. He had his reasons for remaining apart, reasons that tasted like ash, but he also had hands that knew how to halt a falling thing. His outlaw skills would save what the law had let be sold. The choice snapped through him. He studied the crowd more carefully now, his lawman's instincts taking inventory. The buyer with the gold teeth was flanked by two men in expensive suits, hired. Muscle, but the kind that preferred intimidation to violence. Behind them stood a group of ranch hands, their hands stained with honest work, but their eyes hungry for something they couldn't afford. Near the platform, a thin man in a preacher's collar counted coins with shaking fingers, his face a mask of shame and desperation. The auctioneer was a florid man named Beckham, who'd been working these markets for 20 years. Silas had seen his type before. Men who convinced themselves they were just businessmen, that they weren't responsible for the suffering they facilitated. Beckham's voice boomed across the crowd as he described the woman's qualities like she was livestock. Gentle, hence good for needlework, quiet disposition won't cause trouble. And that voice, imagine having your own songbird to soothe away the day's troubles. The bidding started low. $50. The preacher raised his hand, then quickly lowered it when the price jumped to $75. The ranch hands muttered among themselves but made no bids. This was rich man's business, and they knew it. He stepped from the well's shadow into the press of men, and in that instant made himself the wrong sort of thing to ignore. He crossed toward the platform, and the market shifted its weight like a beast waking. He had decided to help. The first man to notice him was the fat-bellied buyer. He smiled with teeth that looked like coins and signaled two goons at his back. The day tightened into a single, dangerous breath. The crowd parted reluctantly as Silas moved through it. Men who'd been laughing and joking moments before now watched him with the wariness of prey animals sensing a predator. His reputation had preceded him to Blackwater, as it did to most places on the frontier. Some knew him as a former lawman gone bad. Others had heard stories of his skills with a gun, his ability to track a man across 200 miles of desert, his talent for appearing where he wasn't expected. Silas moved as if he had always been a shadow. He slipped between trading legs and wagons, a long coat brushing against crates, his fingers finding the seam of the platform as if it were the map of a room he'd slept in for years. He didn't shout. He didn't brandish. He only let his presence be a cold fact in a room that had not counted on being observed. When the buyer barked at him, Silas kept his voice low, the tone that had once read fugitives at a distance. "That woman don't belong here." "Who asked you?" the buyer said. "You the law, Crowe." "Not today," Silas said. He could have told the crowd he was a bounty hunter. He could have worn the last of his old authority as armor. Instead, he let his hands do the talking, and when his fingers touched the edge of the platform, they found what they were looking for. A nail loose, a plank that lifted with a soft groan. He slipped, like a cat, into the space beneath. The space under the platform was cramped and dark, filled with the detritus of 100 market days. Empty bottles, discarded papers, the bones of eaten meals. Silas had spent enough time hiding in similar spaces to feel at home in the shadows. This was where men like him belonged now, in the spaces between respectable society, in the cracks where light didn't reach. Beneath the platform, the smell of horse and sweat was sharper, the world closer. From the thin dark, he could hear the auctioneer's cadence and the woman's humming of the next lullaby line. He slid a hand into the small canvas sack at his hip and took out a pick, nothing more than a length of bent iron. His outlaw past lived in the muscle memory of that pick. It would open locks, whether they belonged to doors or to wrists. The pick had been a gift from another outlaw, a man named Jake Torino, who taught Silas the skills that kept wanted men alive. "Lock-picking," Jake had said, "is like reading a book written in metal. Every lock tells a story, and once you learn the language, you can make any door open." Jake was dead now, killed in a shootout in Tucson 3 years back. But his lessons lived on in Silas's hands. Above him, the bidding continued. The price had reached $200, more money than most men saw in a year. The buyer with the gold teeth was still in the lead, his voice confident and cruel as he called out numbers. "$250!" he shouted. "This one's worth every penny. Look at those hands, soft as silk, and blind means she won't be looking at other men, if you catch my meaning." The crowd laughed, a sound that made Silas's jaw clench. He'd heard that kind of laughter before, in saloons and brothels, wherever men gathered to convince themselves that cruelty was just business. A pair of rough hands seized the back of his coat. "You trying not to pay for a look?" someone hissed. A fist cracked against his ribs, and he didn't bother to pretend surprise. The blow was one he'd felt before. His breath came in, then out. He twisted, used their weight to fling one man into another, and when he came up, the platform was a thunderstorm of fists and shouting. He had to move faster than the men buying people expected an outlaw to move. He had to be surgical. There was a woman's life in the crosshairs. The fight was brief but vicious. Silas had learned long ago that in close quarters, speed mattered more than strength. The first man went down with a knee to the solar plexus. The second caught an elbow to the temple and dropped like a stone. By the time Silas emerged from under the platform, the crowd was in chaos. "Stop him!" the buyer shouted, his gold teeth glinting in the afternoon sun. "He's trying to steal my property." But property was exactly what she wasn't, and Silas intended to prove it. He drew his hand down to the blanket at the woman's knees and found the warmth of it. The first augur of danger was the buyer's laugh, short and bright like the crack of a pistol. Silas's fingers closed on the woman's wrist, and his voice was a hush, an instruction more than a plea. "Come. Quiet." She obeyed because, despite her blindness, she knew the difference between a voice that wanted nothing and one that offered a way out. Her fingers closed on his fingers like a tether. The crowd yelped in surprise as two men in thick coats sprang to intercept them. A knife glinted. Silas's palm found the base of the man's skull, and the rest was taut muscle and sharp timing. A sweep, a fall, the sick sound of a body hitting the rough board. He moved like a man who had been taught to stop other men from doing harm, and then had been told that stopping harm made him a criminal. The woman moved with surprising grace for someone who couldn't see. Her hand in his was steady, trusting in, a way that reminded Silas of why he'd become a lawman in the first place. There had been a time when helping people had been his calling, his purpose. Before the corruption and the frame-up, before the exile and the wanted posters, he'd been a man who stood between the innocent and those who would harm them. "What's your name?" he whispered as they moved across the platform. "Lila," she said, her voice barely audible above the shouting crowd. Lila May Thornton. The name hit him like a physical blow. Thornton. He'd known a family by that name, back in his lawman days, a farming family that had been burned out by raiders 5 years ago. The father had been killed, the mother had disappeared, and the daughter. "Your father was Samuel Thornton," Silas said, not quite a question. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "They killed him, took me. I've been passed from one owner to another ever since." They reached the gap in the platform, where he had lifted the board. He pushed the woman down through the opening and dropped with her into the thin dark beneath the market. Dust in the air turned to spit in his mouth. He tasted iron and the thrill of doing something that would keep him hunted. He had her safe for now, but he knew the world above would not stay still. The buyer's shout rose like a horn. From above came the sound of boots, quick and fanning outward like the teeth of a comb. Silas tightened his hold on the woman, felt the rapid drum of her pulse under her skin. He brushed a hand across her cheek, stubby and calloused, and not used to gentleness. "Can you stand?" he asked. Her jaw worked. "Where?" "Quiet," he said again, and this time it carried no command so much as a promise. He drew out a scarf wound around his neck and wrapped it loosely around her shoulders, fingers practiced in the economy of protection. She smelled of rain and soap, and the faint metallic tang of fear. He led her through the cramped, shadowed space until, against all odds, they sloughed into a back alley where a horse waited, tied to a hitching post with a rope that looked new. The horse was a bay mare, 15 hands high, with intelligent eyes and the kind of sturdy build that could carry 2 riders across rough country. Silas had bought her in Santa Fe 3 months ago, trading his last silver dollar and a stolen watch for the privilege of ownership. She was called Duchess, though he'd never been one for fancy names. She was reliable, and in his line of work, reliability was worth more than speed or beauty. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. Voices shouted orders, boots pounded on wooden planks, and somewhere in the distance, a dog began to bark. Blackwater Market was a small place, and word of the disruption would spread quickly. Soon every man with a gun and a grudge would be looking for them. "Up," Silas said, helping Lila into the saddle. She moved awkwardly, her hands searching for purchase, but she managed to settle herself without complaint. He swung up behind her, his arms coming around her to take the reins. For a moment they sat motionless in the alley, listening to the chaos behind them. "Why?" she asked suddenly. "Why are you helping me?" It was a good question, one he'd been asking himself since the moment he'd decided to act. He could have said it was because he'd known her father, because Samuel Thornton had been a good man who deserved better than to have his daughter sold like cattle. He could have said it was because he still believed in justice, despite everything that had happened to him. He could have said it was because seeing her on that platform had reminded him of who he used to be, before the world had taught him that good men finished last. Instead, he said, "Because it's the right thing to do." Silas didn't ask how she'd been captured. He didn't need to. He had been an observer of human cruelty long enough to know its shapes. He swung the heavy cloak over both their shoulders, lifted her from the saddle, and they rode out of the market. With the buyer's voice still pursuing them like a bad dream, he could already hear the shape of banners and the low, dangerous click of someone pulling loose a gun. Helping a stranger was the sort of thing that could get a man shot in a dozen towns. They rode hard for the first hour, following cattle trails and wagon ruts that led away from Blackwater and into the surrounding wilderness. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that reminded Silas of better times. Duchess was sure-footed on the rocky ground, her breathing steady despite the extra weight. Behind them, dust clouds marked the progress of their pursuers. The buyer wouldn't give up easily. $250 was serious money, and men had killed for far less. More importantly, letting word spread that someone could steal property from Blackwater Market would be bad for business. The traders who ran these auctions depended on a reputation for security. If that reputation was damaged, their entire enterprise could collapse. "They're following us," Lila said. Her voice was calm, but Silas could feel the tension in her body. "No," he replied. "Can you ride bareback?" "I used to before." She paused, then nodded. "Yes, I think so." Silas guided Duchess off the main trail and up a rocky slope that would hide their tracks. The terrain here was rough, all loose stone and stubby brush, but it would make them harder to follow. At the top of the ridge, he stopped and looked back, toward Blackwater. In the distance he could see riders, at least 6 of them, spread out in a search pattern. "We need to split up," he said. "They're looking for 2 people on 1 horse. If we give them 2 trails to follow, it might buy us some time." "I can't see," Lila protested. "How can I?" "Duchess knows these trails better than most men," Silas interrupted. "Trust her, and she'll get you where you need to go." He slipped a small leather pouch into her hands. "There's money in there, enough to get you to the next town. Find a church, tell them your story. Good people will help." "What about you?" Silas looked back at the dust clouds, calculating distances and time. "I'll lead them away, make sure they follow me instead of you." It was a dangerous plan, but it was the best he could think of under the circumstances. The buyers would want both of them, but Silas was the real prize, a wanted man with a reputation and a bounty on his head. If he made himself visible, they'd chase him and forget all about one blind woman on a stolen horse. But Silas had made a choice. He hadn't saved her so he could wear the badge again. He had saved her because there was something of his old self in the act, a thing that liked to set a wrong right, even if the right made him a wanted man. He rode with his face to the wind and the market's dust spitting at his heels, and when Lila, the name she spoke when he asked, closed her fingers around his wrist, he felt the first small, stubborn part of himself unclench. "No," she said firmly. "I'm not leaving you. You don't understand. I understand perfectly." Her voice carried a strength that surprised him. "You think I'm helpless because I'm blind. You think I'll slow you down, be a burden. But I've survived 5 years as a slave, passed from owner to owner, and I'm still alive. I'm stronger than you think." Silas studied her face in the dying light. There was something in her expression that reminded him of his mother, a quiet determination that spoke of inner steel. Maybe she was right. Maybe splitting up wasn't the answer. "All right," he said finally, "but we do this my way. No questions, no arguments. When I say move, you move. When I say hide, you hide. Understood?" She nodded. Understood. They rode on through the gathering darkness, following game trails and deer paths that wound through the hills like silver threads. Silas knew this country well. He'd spent months hiding in these same hills, learning every rock and tree and hidden spring. It was harsh land, unforgiving to those who didn't understand its ways, but it could shelter a man if he knew how to listen to it. The moon was rising now, a pale crescent that provided just enough light to navigate by. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit had faded, but Silas knew their hunters hadn't given up. Men like the buyer didn't give up easily, especially when their reputation was at stake. "Tell me about your father," Silas said as they rode. Conversation would help pass the time and keep Lila's mind off their situation. "He was a good man," she said simply. "Honest, hard-working. He believed in treating people fairly no matter what color their skin was or how much money they had. That's what got him killed in the end." "The raiders?" "They weren't just raiders. They were working for someone who wanted our land. Daddy had the best water rights in the valley, and certain people thought they deserved it more than we did." Her voice grew bitter. "When he wouldn't sell, they found other ways to get what they wanted." They left the market behind, and the afternoon turned twilight with a thin band of pink along the horizon. Beyond the last rise of scrubland, his hideout waited, a cabin carved into a fold of badlands, more shelter than home. It was the sort of place men like him chose, out of the way, defensible, loner-worthy. It smelled of pipe smoke and oil and a life that had learned to endure. He led her there because he had nowhere else to lead a woman who had nowhere else to go. The world would blame him. The world always liked to blame someone. Still, he would be blamed rather than let the life before him be sold into a ledger. The cabin sat in a natural depression between two ridges, invisible from the main trails, but positioned to offer a clear view of anyone approaching. Silas had found it 6 months ago, abandoned by some long-gone prospector who'd given up on finding gold in these hills. It wasn't much. One room, a stone fireplace, walls that leaked wind. In winter, but it was home. He helped Lila down from the horse and led her inside. The cabin was dark and cold, but it was shelter. He struck a match and lit an oil lamp, filling the room with warm yellow light. The furnishings were sparse: a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and shelves lined with canned goods and ammunition. "It's not much," he said, suddenly conscious of how the place must seem to someone who'd grown up in a real home. "It's wonderful," Lila said, and he could tell she meant it. "I haven't been in a real home in 5 years. She moved carefully around the room, her fingers trailing over surfaces as she mapped the space. Her touch was gentle, reverent, as if she were handling precious things. When she reached the shelf where he kept his books, a small collection of dime novels and poetry that he'd never admitted to anyone, she paused. "You read," she said, not a question but a statement. "Sometimes." He felt heat rise in his cheeks. Most outlaws couldn't read, and those who could rarely admitted it. Reading was considered soft, unmanly. "Helps pass the time. What's this one?" She pulled out a slim volume bound in green cloth. "Leaves of Grass. Walt Whitman." She smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. "I know that one. My mother used to read it to me before." She trailed off, but the smile remained. "Would you read some? It's been so long since I heard poetry." Silas took the book with hands that suddenly felt clumsy. He wasn't used to sharing his private pleasures with anyone, but something in her request moved him. He opened to a page at random and began to read in his rough, untrained voice. "I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall. Assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you." As he read, the tension began to drain out of both of them. For a few minutes, they weren't an outlaw and a fugitive slave hiding from pursuit. They were just 2 people sharing words, in the lamplight, finding comfort in beauty that transcended their circumstances. As dusk folded its hand over the land, Silas knew only that he had made the choice to keep her. The rest would find its own hard ways to demand payment. He was ready to pay. The sound of hoofbeats in the distance was another sound entirely. Not the market, not yet, but the slow tightening of the noose. The hoofbeats came closer, and Silas felt his body tense. He set the book aside and moved to the window, peering out through a gap in the boards. In the moonlight, he could see riders approaching, 3 of them, moving slowly and carefully up the trail. "Stay here," he whispered to Lila. "Keep the lamp. Burning, but get behind the bed." She obeyed without question, her movements quick and silent. Silas checked his guns, a Colt .45 on his hip and a shotgun by the door. 6 shots and 2 barrels against 3 men. The odds weren't terrible, but they weren't good either. The riders stopped about 100 yards from the cabin. They sat their horses in silence for several minutes, studying the building and the surrounding terrain. Silas recognized the buyer from the market. His gold teeth glinted in the moonlight. The other 2 were strangers, but they had the look of professional killers. "Crowe," the buyer called out, "I know you're in there. Send out the girl, and we'll call it even." Silas said nothing. Sometimes silence was the best answer. "You can't run forever," the man continued. "This whole territory knows your face. Every lawman, every bounty hunter, every town sheriff has your poster on their wall. Give us the girl, and we'll give you a head start. That's more than fair." It was a reasonable offer, from a certain point of view. Lila was nothing to him, a stranger he'd known for less than a day. Keeping her would only bring trouble down on both their heads. The smart thing, the practical thing, would be to hand her over and ride away. But Silas had stopped being smart and practical the day he'd pinned on his first badge. He'd become a lawman because he believed in protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. That belief had cost him everything, but it was still there, buried under years of cynicism and compromise, but not dead. "The girl stays with me," he called back. The buyer's laugh was ugly. "Have it your way, Crowe, but don't say I didn't give you a chance." The attack came at dawn, just as Silas had expected. Professional killers like to strike when their targets were tired and careless, when the mind was sluggish and the reflexes slow. But Silas hadn't slept. He'd spent the night keeping watch, his guns loaded and ready. The first man came from the north, using the rocks for cover as he approached the cabin. Silas saw him through the window, a thin man with a rifle who moved like he knew his business. The second man flanked from the south, and the third stayed with the horses, ready to cut off any escape. Silas had fought men before, but this was different. These weren't drunken cowboys or desperate farmers. These were professionals, men who killed for money and took pride in their work. They would be patient, methodical, thorough. "Lila," he whispered, "there's a root cellar behind the stove. Go down there and don't come out until I tell you." She nodded and moved quickly to the hiding place he'd shown her the night before. The cellar had been dug by the previous owner, probably to store vegetables and preserves. It was small and dark, but it would keep her safe if things went badly. The first shot came without warning, splintering the window frame inches from Silas's head. He dropped to the floor and crawled to the door, where the shotgun waited. Through the broken window, he could see muzzle flashes from two different positions. They were trying to pin him down, keep him from moving, while the third man got into position. Silas counted the shots, 5 from the north, 3 from the south. Rifles, probably Winchesters, which meant they had plenty of ammunition. He needed to change the dynamic, force them to react instead of dictating the terms of the fight. He kicked open the door and rolled out onto the porch, the shotgun in his hands. The movement drew fire from both positions, but he was already moving, using an overturned water trough for cover. The shotgun boomed twice, filling the air with buckshot and smoke. A scream from the north told him he'd hit something. Good. Even if it wasn't a killing shot, a wounded man was a distraction for his partners. The return fire was immediate and overwhelming. Bullets whined off the rocks around him, kicking up sprays of stone and dust. These men knew what they were doing. They were trying to flush him out, force him into the open where they could finish him. The battle raged for the better part of an hour. Silas used every trick he'd learned in his years as a lawman and an outlaw, changing positions, using the terrain, making every shot count. But he was outnumbered and outgunned, and his ammunition was running low. The wounded man from the north had stopped shooting, which meant he was either dead or out of the fight. That left 2, but they were being more careful now, taking fewer risks. They knew time was on their side. Eventually, Silas would run out of bullets or make a mistake that would cost him his life. He was down to his last 3 shotgun shells when he heard something that changed everything. Hoofbeats coming, fast up the trail. At first he thought it was reinforcements for his attackers, but then he heard something else. A woman's voice, shouting in Spanish. The shooting stopped as everyone tried to identify the new arrivals. Through the dust and smoke, Silas could see a group of riders approaching, 5 men and a woman, all armed and riding hard. They wore the wide sombreros and colorful serapes of Mexican vaqueros, but something about the way they moved suggested they were more than simple cowboys. The leader was a woman in her 40s, with steel-gray hair and eyes like flint. She rode like she'd been born on horseback, her rifle held ready but not threatening. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "This is private land," she announced in accented English. "You are trespassing." The Somme buyer, who had emerged from behind a rock to get a better look at the newcomers, laughed nervously. "We're just conducting business, Senora. Nothing that concerns you." "All business on my land concerns me," the woman replied. "I am Elena Vasquez, and this is the Double V Ranch. You will leave now, or my men will make you leave." Silas recognized the name. Elena Vasquez was a legend in this part of the territory, a woman who had inherited a vast ranch from her dead husband and had spent 20 years fighting off claim jumpers, rustlers, and anyone else who thought a woman couldn't hold land. She was known to be fair but ruthless, a friend to those who respected her, but an implacable enemy to those who crossed her. The buyer looked around nervously. His men were good, but they were only 3 against 6, and the Mexicans had the advantage of position and numbers. More importantly, this was Vasquez land, which meant any shooting would bring down the full weight of her organization. "We have a legal claim," the buyer protested. "That man is a thief, and the woman is stolen property." Elena's laugh was like breaking glass. "Property? She is a human being, not a horse to be bought and sold. And as for your legal claim, show me papers." The standoff stretched for several minutes, each side measuring the other and calculating odds. Finally, the buyer made his decision. He was a businessman, not a warrior, and the mathematics of the situation were clear. Even if he won this fight, it would cost him more than Lila was worth. "This isn't over, Crowe," he called out as he mounted his horse. "I'll be back with the law." "The law," Elena said quietly, "will find you have no jurisdiction here. This is Mexican territory under the old land grants, and Mexican law does not recognize slavery." It was a bluff. The territory had been American for decades, but it was a convincing one. The buyer and his men rode away, but Silas knew they would be back. Men like that didn't give up easily, especially when their reputation was at stake. Elena and her vaqueros approached the cabin slowly, their weapons lowered but ready. Silas emerged from behind the water trough, his shotgun broken open to show it was empty. It was a gesture of trust, but also of practical necessity. He was out of ammunition anyway. "Senor Crowe," Elena said, dismounting with fluid grace. "Your reputation precedes you." "Ma'am," Silas replied, touching the brim of his hat, "I'm grateful for your intervention, but I don't want to bring trouble to your land." "Trouble has a way of finding us all," Elena said with a shrug. "The question is what we do with it when it arrives." She studied the cabin, taking in the bullet holes and broken windows. "You fought well for 1 man against 3. 2.5. Silas corrected. "I winged 1 early on." Elena smiled, the expression transforming her stern face. "Modest? I like that in a man." She turned to one of her vaqueros. "Miguel, see to the wounded man. If he lives, bandage him. If he dies, bury him." Lila emerged from the cabin, moving carefully in the unfamiliar daylight. She looked pale but composed, her chin raised with quiet dignity. Elena studied her with the eye of someone who had seen much suffering and recognized strength when she saw it. "And you, Nina," Elena said gently, "you are the cause of all this shooting." "I didn't ask to be," Lila replied, her voice steady. "But I won't apologize for wanting to be free." "Good. Never apologize for wanting what is rightfully yours." Elena turned back to Silas. "What will you do now? Those men will return, and next time they will bring more guns." Silas had been asking himself the same question since the shooting started. The cabin was compromised now, no longer safe. He could run. He'd been running for years, and he was good at it. But running meant leaving Lila behind, and that was no longer an option. "I don't know," he admitted. "Find another place to hide, I suppose. Keep moving until they lose interest." "Or until they kill you," Elena said bluntly. "Men like those do not lose interest, especially when their pride has been wounded." She was quiet for a moment, thinking. There is another way. I'm listening. Work for me, both of you. My ranch is large and I can always use good people. You know guns and have experience with troublemakers. Eleanor looked at Lila with consideration. She has gentle hands and a beautiful voice. My household could use both. It was a generous offer, more generous than Silas had any right to expect. But he knew there would be strings attached. Women like Elena Vasquez didn't do favors out of her kindness alone. What's the catch, he asked. Elena laughed, a rich sound that spoke of genuine amusement. Straight to the point. I like that too. Her expression grew serious. The catch is that my ranch has enemies, men who want my land, my water, my cattle. Some of them are the same men who burned out the Thorntons and others like them. If you work for me, you will be fighting them again. Silas felt something stir in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose, the chance to stand for something again, to fight the good fight even if he couldn't wear a badge while doing it. Senora, he said formally, I'd be honored to work for you. And I, Lila added quickly, if you'll have me. Elena nodded as if she'd expected no other answer. Bueno, Miguel will escort you to the ranch. I have business in town, but I will see you both tonight. She paused, studying Silas with those flint-hard eyes. There is one more thing. The men who were here today, they work for a man named Cartwright. He owns half the territory and wants to own the other half. He will not stop coming after you, not until one of you is dead. Then I guess I'd better make sure it's him, Silas said quietly. Elena smiled again, and this time there was something predatory in the expression. I was hoping you would say that. The Double V Ranch sprawled across a valley like a small city. Adobe buildings clustered around a central courtyard, their red tile roofs gleaming in the afternoon sun. Cattle dotted the surrounding pastures, fat and sleek under the care of skilled vaqueros. It was prosperity built on sweat and defended. With steel, the kind of success that made enemies. Miguel led them to the main house, a sprawling structure that spoke of wealth earned rather than inherited. The walls were thick adobe, designed to stay cool in summer and warm in winter. Gardens bloomed in carefully tended plots, and the sound of running water came from hidden fountains. La Patrona, she built all this, Miguel explained as they dismounted. He was a man in his 50s, grizzled and competent, with the easy confidence of someone who had found his place in the world. When Senor Vasquez died, everyone thought she would sell and go back to Mexico. Instead, she stayed and made it bigger. How? Long ago was that, Silas asked. 20 years. I was just a boy then, but I remember. There were men who thought they could take what was hers, just because she was a woman. They learned different. Miguel's smile was grim with remembered satisfaction. La Patrona. She is not someone you want as an enemy. They were shown to quarters, in a long, low building that housed the ranch hands. Silas was given a small room with a bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the horse corrals. It was simple but clean, better than many places he'd slept in recent years. Lila was housed in the main house, in rooms traditionally reserved for governesses and housekeepers. It was a mark of respect that wasn't lost on either of them. Elena Vasquez was making it clear that despite their circumstances, they were to be treated as valued employees, not fugitives seeking charity. That evening, they gathered in the main house for dinner. The dining room was large and comfortable, furnished with heavy wooden furniture that spoke of Mexican craftsmanship. Elena presided at the head of the table, still wearing her riding clothes, but somehow managing to look elegant anyway. Tomorrow, she said as they ate, Miguel will show you the ranch, help you understand how we do things here. But tonight, I want to hear your story, all of it. So Silas told it, starting with his days as a young sheriff, full of idealism, and ending with the rescue at Blackwater Market. He left out nothing, the corruption he'd fought, the frame-up that had destroyed his career, the years of running and hiding that had followed. Elena listened without interruption, her dark eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, the room was quiet, except for the crackling of the fire in the massive stone fireplace. Finally, Elena spoke. "You know Cartwright was behind it," she said. "It wasn't a question. I suspected, but I could never prove it. The man who framed me disappeared before I could question him. The witnesses recanted their testimony. The evidence vanished." Silas's voice was bitter with old frustration. "Money has a way of making the truth flexible. Cartwright owns judges, sheriffs, even some federal marshals," Elena said. "He has been trying to squeeze me out for years, but I have something it doesn't, the loyalty of good people." She gestured around the table. "Miguel has been with me for 20 years. Maria, my cook, 15. Pedro, my foreman, 12. They stay not because I pay them well, though I do, but because they know I will fight for them as hard as they fight for me." "And now you're asking us to fight for you too," Lila said quietly. "I am asking you to fight for yourselves," Elena corrected. "Cartwright will never stop hunting you. The only way to be truly safe is to remove the threat." "You're talking about killing him," Silas said. "I am talking about justice. The law has failed because Cartwright owns the law. But there are older laws, deeper laws, that no amount of money can buy." Elena's voice grew hard. "He killed your friend's father. He destroyed your career. He has robbed and murdered and stolen for 20 years, and he has never paid for any of it. Perhaps it is time for the bill to come due." Silas thought about Samuel Thornton, murdered for defending his land and his principles. He thought about all the other good people who had been destroyed by Cartwright's greed. He thought about the badge he'd once worn and the oath he'd taken to protect the innocent. "What did you have in mind?" he asked. Elena's plan was audacious in its simplicity. Cartwright owned a vast estate outside the territorial capital, a fortress-like compound where he conducted his business and entertained politicians and judges. Once a month, he held a gathering there, part social event, part business meeting, in part display of power. All of his key allies would be present, along with their families and retainers. "He thinks he is untouchable there," Elena explained, spreading a hand-drawn map on the table. "The compound is heavily guarded, but the guards are watching for armies, not individuals. A small group, properly motivated and well-prepared, could get inside." "And then what?" Silas asked. "Even if we could reach Cartwright, killing him wouldn't solve anything. Someone else would just take his place." "Not if we take his records," Elena said with a smile that was all teeth. "Cartwright keeps detailed accounts of every bribe, every threat, every illegal transaction he's ever made. He thinks it gives him power over people, insurance against betrayal. But those same records could destroy him and everyone who works with him. It was brilliant," Silas had to admit. With Cartwright's records, they could expose the entire network of corruption that had infected the territory. Judges, sheriffs, politicians, all of them would fall. It wouldn't bring perfect justice, but it would be a start. "How do you know about these records?" Lila asked. Elena's expression grew sad. "Because my husband used to work for Cartwright before we were married. He told me about the records, about the things Cartwright made him do. It was guilt over those things that brought him to me, seeking redemption. He found it, but it cost him his life. Cartwright had him killed when he refused to continue the partnership." "I'm sorry," Silas said, "and meant it. So am I. But Francisco's death taught me something important. Sometimes the only way to stop evil is to fight it directly. The law failed my husband, just as it failed you. But we don't have to fail each other." They spent the rest of the evening planning. The gathering was scheduled for the following weekend, which gave them 6 days to prepare. Elena had contacts inside Cartwright's organization, servants and workers who had their own grudges against their employer. Getting inside the compound would be dangerous, but not impossible. "There will be no going back after this," Elena warned, as they prepared to retire for the evening. If we succeed, we will have made powerful enemies. If we fail, we will all be dead. Are you certain this is what you want?" Silas looked at Lila, seeing his own determination reflected in her sightless eyes. They had both lost everything to Cartwrights. Agreed. They had both been branded as criminals for standing up to corruption, but they were not alone anymore. They had found allies, people willing to fight for justice, even when the law would not. "I'm certain," he said. The days that followed were filled with preparation. Miguel taught Silas the layout of Cartwright's compound, information gathered from servants and former employees who had worked there over the years. Elena's network of contacts provided details about guard rotations, escape routes, and the location of Cartwright's private office, where the records were kept. Lila, meanwhile, proved herself invaluable in ways that surprised everyone. Her blindness, which had seemed like a handicap, turned out to be an asset when it came to moving silently and remembering complex layouts. She could navigate by touch and sound better than most people could with their eyes, and her gentle manner made the other ranch workers trust her quickly. "She reminds me of my sister," Maria, the cook, confided to Elena one afternoon. "The same strength hidden beneath softness, the same ability to see what others miss." Elena nodded thoughtfully. She'd been watching both Silas and Lila carefully, evaluating their skills and their commitment. What she saw pleased her. Silas had the experience and the skills needed for what they were planning, but more importantly, he had the moral conviction. He wasn't doing this for money or revenge, but because it was right. Lila's motivations were more complex. She wanted justice for her father, of course, but there was something else, a desire to prove that she was more than just a victim, that her blindness didn't make her helpless. Elena understood that desire intimately. She had felt the same thing when her husband died and everyone expected her to crumble. On the Thursday before the gathering, a messenger arrived with disturbing news. Cartwright had hired additional security for the event, professionals from back east, men with military experience and no local loyalties. The job had just become much more dangerous. "We could postpone," Elena suggested during their evening planning session. "Wait for another opportunity." "No," Silas said firmly. "Every day we wait, more people suffer, and Cartwright will only get stronger, more careful. This may be our only chance." "He's right," Lila agreed. "We've come too far to turn back now." Elena studied them both for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well, but we adjust the plan. Instead of 3 of us going in, we send only 2, Silas and myself. Lila stays here as backup, ready to get word to the authorities if things go wrong." "Absolutely not," Lila said, her voice sharp with anger. "This is my fight as much as yours. I won't be left behind like some helpless child." "You're not helpless," Elena said gently, "but you would be a liability in a situation like this. Fighting, climbing, moving quickly in the dark, these are things that require sight, are they?" Lila stood and moved across the room with fluid grace, avoiding furniture and obstacles without apparent effort. At the far wall, she found a particular book on a shelf without hesitation. "I've been mapping this house for 6 days. I know every room, every corridor, every door. I know which steps creak and which windows stick. Could either of you move through it as quietly as I can?" It was a compelling demonstration, and Elena had to admit that Lila made a good point. The girl had skills that could be useful, and her determination was undeniable. More importantly, Elena was beginning to understand that this mission meant something different to each of them. For Silas, it was about redemption, a chance to be a lawman again, even if only for one night. For Elena, it was about revenge and the protection of her people. But for Lila, it was about proving that she was more than her disability, more than a victim to be rescued. "All right," Elena said finally, "but we do this carefully. No unnecessary risks, no heroics. We get in, get the records, and get out. If anything goes wrong, we abort and try again another time. They spent the remaining days refining their plan. Elena's contacts had provided them with detailed information about the compound's security. Arrangements. The guards were most alert during the day, when important visitors were arriving and departing. At night, during the social events, their attention would be focused inward, on protecting the guests rather than watching for intruders. The records were kept in Cartwright's private study, a room on the second floor of the main house. There would require crossing an open courtyard, climbing an exterior wall, and navigating through the upper floors without being detected. It was dangerous, but not impossible for people with the right skills and sufficient motivation. On the night before the mission, Elena gathered her entire household in the main dining room. Ranch hands, servants, vaqueros, everyone who called the Double V home was present. She stood at the head of the table, her expression grave but determined. "Tomorrow night," she said, "we strike a blow for justice, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who has suffered under Cartwright's rule. Some of you have lost family to his greed. Others have seen friends destroyed by his corruption. All of you have lived under the shadow of his power for too long." The room was absolutely silent. These were hard people, accustomed to difficulty and danger, but what Elena was proposing went beyond anything they had faced before. "I will not order any of you to participate," Elena continued. "This is my choice, my responsibility. But if you choose to stand with me, know that you will be fighting for something greater than one ranch, greater than one family. You will be fighting for the idea that justice still means something in this territory." One by one they stood, Miguel first, then Maria, then Pedro and the others, not because they had to, but because they wanted to, because Elena Vasquez had earned their loyalty through 20 years of fair treatment and honest dealing, because they believed in what she was trying to do. The night of Cartwright's gathering was moonless and cloudy, perfect for their purposes. Silas, Elena, and Lila rode out from the Double V at sunset, taking a circuitous route that would bring them to the compound from the east, where the terrain was roughest and the guards least watchful. They left their horses a mile away, hidden, in a grove of cottonwoods near a seasonal creek. From there, they would proceed on foot, using the darkness and their knowledge of the compound's layout to avoid detection. Silas had traded his usual gunfighter's attire for dark clothing that would blend with the shadows. Elena wore the black dress of a widow, respectable enough to pass casual inspection, but practical enough for climbing and fighting. Lila was dressed as a servant, invisible to the kind of men who attended Cartwright's gatherings. "Remember," Elena whispered as they approached the compound's outer fence, "we are not here to fight. We are here to steal information and expose corruption. If we are discovered, we run. No heroics, no last stands." But even as she said it, Elena knew that events had a way of taking on their own momentum. Once they were inside Cartwright's stronghold, anything could happen. The man had destroyed too many lives, hurt too many people, for this to end quietly. The compound was everything Elena had described and more. High walls topped with broken glass surrounded several acres of carefully manicured grounds. Guard towers stood at the corners, manned by alert sentries with rifles. The main house was a monument to wealth and power, 3 stories of imported stone and expensive glass that spoke of money beyond most people's comprehension. But wealth and power had made Cartwright complacent. His guards were watching for armies, not for 3 people moving like shadows through the night. They crossed the outer perimeter without incident, using a drainage culvert that Elena's contacts had identified as a weak point in the defenses. Inside the compound, they could hear music and laughter from the main house. Cartwright's gathering was in full swing, which meant the man himself would be playing host, far from his private study and the incriminating records they had come to steal. "The study is on the second floor, northeast corner," Elena whispered. "There's a trellis on the east wall that should support our weight." They moved across the grounds like ghosts, staying in the shadows cast by ornamental trees and garden walls. Twice they had to freeze as guards passed nearby, but the men were casual, expecting no trouble on such a well-defended estate. The trellis was exactly where Elena's informant had said it would be, though it looked less sturdy than they had hoped. Silas tested it carefully, making sure it would hold before beginning his climb. Elena followed, then Lila, moving with the fluid grace that came from a lifetime of navigating by touch rather than sight. The surrender of Marcus Cartwright marked the end of an era in territorial politics. Within weeks of his arrest, the full extent of his criminal empire became clear as federal investigators, armed with his own records, began dismantling the network of corruption he had built over 20 years. Judges, sheriffs, politicians, and businessmen found themselves facing charges ranging from bribery to murder. Some fled the territory rather than face trial. Others, following Cartwright's example, chose to cooperate with investigators in hopes of receiving lighter sentences. The trials that followed were everything Silas had promised: fair, thorough, and conducted according to law. Federal judges were brought in to ensure impartiality. Evidence was presented methodically and evaluated carefully. Even Cartwright, architect of so much suffering, received the due process that he had denied to so many others. Not everyone was satisfied with the outcomes. Some believed that men like Cartwright deserved death for their crimes. Others thought that wealthy criminals were receiving preferential treatment despite their convictions. But the trials established an important principle: that justice could prevail over corruption when good people were willing to fight for it. Elena Vasquez became something of a folk hero, the woman who had stood up to the most powerful man in the territory and won. But she seemed uncomfortable with the attention, preferring to focus on rebuilding and improving her ranch rather than basking in celebrity. "I didn't do this for glory," she told a reporter who had come to interview her. "I did it because it needed to be done. There are still problems in this territory, still injustices that need to be addressed. The work isn't finished just because one criminal is behind bars." Lila Thornton's story captured the public imagination in a different way. Here was a young woman who had survived slavery, blindness, and years of abuse, only to emerge as one of the key figures in exposing territorial corruption. Publishers competed to buy the rights to her story, and speaking invitations poured in from across the country. But like Elena, Lila seemed more interested in substance than fame. She used her newfound prominence to advocate for other victims of trafficking and slavery, working to establish safe houses and support networks for those trying to rebuild their lives. "My father always said that suffering was only worthwhile if you learned something from it," she explained to one interviewer. "I learned that people are stronger than they think they are, and that justice is possible if you're willing to fight for it." As for Silas Crowe, the transformation of his public image was perhaps the most dramatic of all. The man who had been branded as an outlaw and fugitive was now hailed as a hero who had sacrificed everything to expose corruption and restore justice to the territory. Offers came pouring in, requests to serve as sheriff in various towns, invitations to join federal law enforcement, even suggestions that he run for territorial representative. But Silas found himself strangely reluctant to return to official law enforcement. "I've learned something in these past few months," he explained to Elena one evening, as they sat on the porch of her ranch house, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "Sometimes justice has to come from outside the system, from people who are willing to break bad laws to uphold good principles." "You sound like you're planning to stay an outlaw," Elena observed with amusement. "Not an outlaw," Silas corrected, but not exactly a lawman either. Something in between, maybe. Someone who can work both sides of the line when necessary. It was an intriguing concept, and one that appealed to territorial officials who were struggling to clean up the mess left by Cartwright's criminal organization. Within months, Silas found himself appointed as a special investigator with broad authority to pursue corruption wherever he found it. The position suited him perfectly. He had the backing of legitimate authority when he needed it, but also the freedom to operate outside normal channels when circumstances required it. It was a unique role for a unique situation, and he proved remarkably effective at it. Lila remained at the Double V Ranch, officially serving as Elena's secretary and unofficial advisor, but actually functioning as something closer to a partner. Her insights into human nature, sharpened by years of observing people who thought she couldn't see them, proved invaluable in identifying and understanding criminal behavior. Together, the three of them formed an unusual but effective team. Elena provided resources and political connections. Silas brought law enforcement experience and investigative skills. Lila contributed intelligence analysis and strategic thinking. They complemented each other perfectly, and their success rate in exposing and stopping corruption became legendary throughout the territory. But perhaps their greatest achievement was something harder to quantify: the restoration of hope among ordinary citizens who had given up on the possibility of honest government. "People are starting to believe again," Miguel observed one day as he watched a group of farmers meeting with territorial officials to discuss water rights. "They're starting to think that maybe the system can work for them instead of against them." It was a fragile hope, and they all knew it could be easily shattered by new corruption or cynicism. But it was real, and it was growing, fed by each successful prosecution and each corrupt official brought to justice. 2 years after the fall of Marcus Cartwright, the territory had been transformed. New laws governing campaign finance and government. Transparency had been enacted. Federal oversight of territorial administration had been strengthened. Most importantly, a new generation of honest officials had emerged to replace those who had been corrupted or discredited. The changes weren't perfect, no system ever was, but they represented genuine progress toward the ideals of justice and fair government that Silas had first sworn to uphold when he pinned on his badge all those years ago. On a warm evening in late summer, as the three unlikely allies sat on Elena's porch watching another spectacular sunset, Lila asked a question that had been on all their minds. "What happens now? We've accomplished what we set out to do. Cartwright is in prison, his organization is destroyed, and the territory has honest government again. Do we just go back to normal lives?" It was a good question, and one that didn't have an easy answer. They had been brought together by crisis and united by purpose. With that crisis resolved and their purpose achieved, what held them together now? "I don't think any of us can go back to what we were before," Elena said thoughtfully. "We've learned too much, seen too much, changed too much." "Besides," Silas added, "there's always more work to be done. Corruption is like a weed. Cut it down, and it grows back unless you keep tending the garden." "So we keep fighting," Lila said. "It wasn't really a question." "We keep fighting," Elena agreed. "But maybe now we fight smarter, with more resources and better support." Over the following months, their informal partnership evolved into something more structured. Elena established a foundation dedicated to fighting corruption and supporting victims of governmental abuse. Silas became its chief investigator, with the authority to pursue cases across territorial lines. Lila served as its coordinator, using her organizational skills to manage information and resources. They took on cases that other agencies couldn't or wouldn't handle, corruption that crossed jurisdictional boundaries, crimes committed by people too powerful for local law enforcement to touch, injustices that had been ignored because the victims were poor or powerless. It wasn't easy work. There were failures as well as successes, setbacks as well as victories. They made new enemies and faced new dangers. But they also made a difference, one case at a time, one corrupt official at a time, one rescued victim at a time. And somewhere along the way, they discovered that they had become more than allies or even friends. They had become family, bound together not by blood or law, but by shared purpose and mutual respect. Years passed, and their legend grew. Stories were told in saloons and around campfires about the blind woman who could see through any deception, the former outlaw who had become the territory's most effective lawman, and the rancher who had taken on the most powerful man in the territory and won. Some of the stories were true, others were embellished or entirely fictional, but all of them served the same purpose. They reminded people that justice was possible, that corruption could be fought, and that ordinary citizens had the power to change their world if they were willing to stand up for what was right. Silas never did return to wearing a badge in the traditional sense, but in a very real way, he had never stopped being a lawman. The principles that had driven him to become a sheriff in the first place, the desire to protect the innocent and see justice done, were still there, as strong as ever. Elena continued to run her ranch, but it had evolved into something more than a simple cattle operation. It became a symbol of what was possible when honest people stood together against corruption. Visitors came from across the country to see the place where the fight for territorial justice had begun. Lila's story inspired a generation of women to believe that they could overcome any obstacle if they had courage and determination. She received hundreds of letters from women facing their own challenges, and she answered each one personally, offering advice and encouragement. But perhaps their greatest legacy was the institutional changes they had helped bring about. The territorial government was now among the most transparent and accountable in the nation. Corruption still existed, it always would, but it was harder to hide and easier to prosecute when discovered. "We didn't eliminate corruption," Silas reflected during one of their evening conversations, "but we made it harder and more dangerous, and we proved that ordinary people can fight back successfully. More importantly," Elena added, "we proved that it's worth fighting, that justice isn't just an impossible dream, but something that real people can achieve if they're willing to work for it." Lila nodded thoughtfully. "My father used to say that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. I think the same thing is true of justice. You can't win it once and then forget about it. You have to keep fighting for it every day, in small ways and large ones." As the sun set over the mountains and painted the sky in familiar shades of gold and crimson, the three friends sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts, but united in their shared understanding of what they had accomplished and what still remained to be done. The territory was a better place because of their efforts. Not perfect, nowhere ever was, but better. And that, they had learned, was often the most that anyone could hope to achieve. The fight for justice would continue, as it always had and always would. But they had proven that it was a fight worth having, and a fight that could be won by people with courage, determination, and faith in the possibility of a better world. And in the end, perhaps that was the most important victory of all. The sun has set on Silas Crowe's journey from outlaw to hero, but every ending is also a new beginning. Just as Silas, Elena, and Lila proved that ordinary people can fight corruption and win, you too have the power to make a difference. If this story of courage, justice, and redemption resonated with you, show your support by hitting that like button Share this tale with others who believe that justice is worth fighting for, and subscribe to our channel to join a community that believes in the power of great storytelling to inspire and transform. Because like the fight for justice itself, great stories are meant to be shared. They're meant to inspire others to stand up for what's right, to never give up hope, and to remember that even in the darkest times, heroes can emerge from the most unlikely places.